the transport ship exploded in silence against the black void of space. Jiho watched through the escape pod's small window as pieces of metal drifted away like silver leaves in an invisible wind. He was the only survivor. The pirates had taken everything valuable and left the rest to die in the cold emptiness between stars. But death did not come for Jiho that day. A Valdari patrol ship found his pod 3 days later, floating near the edge of their territory. When they brought him aboard, the first thing they noticed was how different he looked from other refugees. Most beings who survived pirate attacks carried weapons or valuable technology. They came with plans for revenge or dreams of riches. Gho carried nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bag containing old books made of real paper. The books were written in human languages that the Valdari computers could not read. Officer Kyra stood in the processing center of Station Meridian and looked at the strange human sitting across from her desk. He was not large or strong like the warrior races. He did not have the clever eyes of the traitor species. He seemed ordinary in every way, except for how he spoke. When Kira asked him about his homeworld, Jiho did not simply give facts and numbers. Instead, he told her a story. He spoke of Earth as a blue marble hanging in space, covered with vast oceans that reflected sunlight like mirrors. He described cities that grew like forests of glass and steel, reaching toward the sky. He told her about rain that smelled like clean air and flowers, about snow that fell soft and white in winter, about winds that carried the songs of birds. Across green fields. Kyra found herself listening with her mouth slightly open. She had processed thousands of refugees in her 10 years of service. They all told her about their worlds in the same way. Population numbers, resource reports, technical specifications. But Jiho made her see his world as if she were standing on its surface. The human continued his story. He told her about the siege of Nusol, when enemy ships surrounded the city for 6 months. The defenders had no food, no power, no hope. But they did not surrender. Instead, they shared what little they had. Children gave their toys to comfort crying babies. Old people told stories to keep young soldiers brave during the long night. When the siege finally ended, the city was broken, but its people were stronger than before. As Jiho spoke, Kyra felt something strange happening in her chest. It was like a warm feeling spreading through her body. She realized she was not just hearing about events that happened to strangers, she was understanding what it felt like to be hungry but still share your food. She was feeling what it meant to be afraid, but still stay brave. This had never happened to her before. The processing interview should have taken 10 minutes. It lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Kyra sat alone in her office for a long time, thinking about blue skies and falling snow and people who chose kindness even when they had nothing left to give. The next day, Jiho was sent to Nethys Prime, a mining world in the outer territories. The planet was ugly and gray, covered with factories that turned raw materials into products for the Valdari Empire. Thousands of beings from conquered species worked in the mines and assembly plants. They lived in simple dormitories and ate basic food and never complained because complaint meant punishment. Jiho was assigned to Mining Complex 7, where he would spend 12 hours each day breaking rocks deep underground. The work was hard and dangerous. Many workers died from accidents or exhaustion. The survivors learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. But Jiho was different. On his first night in the dormitory, he sat with a group of Corvani miners during the evening meal. The Corvani were a proud people who had once explored the stars. But the Valdari had conquered their worlds 50 years ago. Now they spent their lives in dark tunnels, their dreams of exploration forgotten. The eldest Corvani, whose name was Bonsu, asked Jiho where he came from. Instead of giving a simple answer, Jiho told them about humanity's first journey to another star. He described the brave crew who left Earth not knowing if they would ever return home. Their ship was small and slow, and the journey took many years. Some crew members grew old and died before reaching their destination. Others went crazy from the loneliness of space. But they continued because they believed that knowledge and discovery were worth any price. When they finally reached the new star system, they found wonders beyond imagination. Planets with purple oceans and crystal mountains. Moons where the gravity was so light that a person could jump from cliff to cliff like a bird. Gas giants with storms that created music when the winds moved through their clouds. The Corvani miners listened in complete silence. As Jiho spoke, their tired eyes began to shine. They remembered their own people's first voyages, their own dreams of touching distant worlds. For the first time in years, they felt something other than exhaustion and despair. The next night, more workers came to hear Jiho's stories. He told them about a human colony that survived a plague by working together. He spoke of explorers who got lost in space and found their way home by following the songs of star whales. He described festivals where different species gathered to share food and music and celebrate their differences instead of fighting about them. Each story was different, but they all carried the same message. People could survive terrible things if they helped each other. Different kinds of beings could live together in peace. Even when everything seemed hopeless, there was always a reason to keep trying. the workers began to change. They started talking to each other during meals instead of eating in silence. They learned each other's names and shared stories about their own worlds and families. A pethary technician fixed a broken tool for a Yoltec farmer without being asked. A group of miners worked together to help an injured friend instead of leaving him to die. These small acts of kindness were dangerous. The Valdari Empire controlled people by keeping them separate and afraid. When different species began to trust each other, when workers started caring about more than just survival, the carefully maintained order began to crack. Overseer Deho noticed the changes first. Production numbers were dropping because workers spent time talking instead of focusing only on their tasks. He heard laughter coming from the dormitories at night, which had never happened before. Most disturbing of all, he saw beings from different species helping each other, sharing resources, acting like they belonged to the same community. This was not how the empire was supposed to work. Deho began watching the workers more carefully. He discovered that all the changes seemed to center around one person, the human called Jiho, who worked quietly during the day but spoke for hours each evening, telling stories that made people forget their proper place in the imperial order. Overseer realized he was seeing something that had never happened before in the 300-year history of the Valdari Empire. The conquered peoples were beginning to see themselves not as separate, defeated races, but as part of something larger. They were developing hope, and hope, Deho knew, was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The report landed on Administrator Sunho's desk 3 weeks after Jiho arrived on Nethys Prime. It was labeled as a routine productivity assessment, but the numbers inside made Sunho's hands shake as he read them. Production was down 15% across 12 mining complexes. Worker injuries had decreased, which should have been good news, but the reason worried him. The injured were being helped by other workers instead of being left to recover alone. Medical supplies were being shared between different species, something that had never happened before. Most disturbing of all were the surveillance recordings. Workers from different planets were talking to each other during mealtimes. They were learning each other's languages. They were asking questions about each other's home worlds and families. The Valdari Empire had ruled for 3 centuries by keeping conquered peoples separate. A Corvani miner was supposed to see a pethary technician as a stranger, maybe even an enemy. They were not supposed to discover that both their peoples had lost their homeworlds to Valdari conquest. They were not supposed to realize they shared the same pain. Sunho had been an administrator for 20 years. He understood how the empire worked. Fear kept people obedient. Isolation kept them weak. Hope made them dangerous. The reports were coming from other worlds too. A factory on Zarian Beta, where workers had started singing together during their shifts. A farming colony on Talos, where different species were sharing traditional recipes. A construction site on Vega 9, where beings were teaching each other their native crafts during rest periods. All of these changes could be traced back to stories. Stories that traveled from person to person, like seeds carried by wind. Stories that somehow made beings who had nothing in common realize they were not so different after all. Sunho decided to investigate personally. He traveled to a textile factory on Kepler 7, where production had dropped 20% in the past month. The factory supervisor, a nervous Valdari named Wujin, met him at the landing pad. The workers have become strange, Wujin explained, as they walked through the facility. They help each other too much, they waste time talking. Yesterday, I saw a Yoltec worker teaching a Corvani how to repair a broken machine. They are supposed to do only their assigned tasks. What caused this change? Sunho asked. Stories, Wujin said, speaking the word like it tasted bad. Someone told them stories about other worlds, other peoples. Now they think they understand each other. That evening, Sunho disguised himself as a quality inspector and sat in the worker cafeteria. He listened as a young pethary woman named Anji told a group of mixed species about something she had heard from a friend on another world. There was once a human ship that got lost in space, Anji said. The crew came from many different planets. They spoke different languages and ate different foods and worshipped different gods. For weeks they fought with each other, blaming their problems on their differences. The workers around the table leaned forward, listening carefully. But then, their ship started to break down. Yunji continued. The human captain realized they would all die unless they worked together. So she asked each crew member to teach the others something from their home world. The engineer from Proxima taught them how to fix machines with simple tools. The navigator from Vega taught them how to read star patterns. The cook from Earth taught them how to make food that would keep them healthy on long journeys. What happened then? Asked an old Corvani miner. They discovered that their differences made them stronger, not weaker. Each person knew something the others needed to learn. By the time they reached safety, they were not just a crew anymore. They were a family. Sunho felt a cold chill run down his spine. The story was simple, but its message was clear. Different peoples could work together. They could become stronger by sharing their knowledge instead of competing with each other. They could choose cooperation over conflict. This was exactly the kind of thinking that could destroy the empire. The next day, Sunho traveled to mining Complex 7 on Nethys Prime. He needed to see the source of these dangerous ideas for himself. He found Jiho in the deep tunnels. Working alongside a crew of Corvani miners, the human was smaller than most of his co-workers, but he kept up with their pace. More importantly, he talked while he worked, sharing stories that made the difficult labor seem less painful. My grandmother used to tell me about the old days on Earth, Jiho was saying as he broke apart a large rock. Back then, people lived in small villages where everyone knew everyone else. When harvest time came, the whole village would work together in the fields. When winter came, families would share food and fuel to make sure nobody went hungry or cold. That sounds like paradise, said one of the Corvani miners. It wasn't paradise, Jiho replied. There were still problems. People still got sick and died. Crops sometimes failed. Wars still happened. But when bad things occurred, people faced them together. That made even the worst times bearable. Sunho watched from the shadows as the miners worked. He noticed how they helped each other lift heavy stones, how they shared water during breaks, how they warned each other about dangerous cave-ins. These simple acts of kindness would have been impossible just a few weeks ago. That evening, Sunho sat in his temporary quarters and wrote a report to his superiors. He explained that the productivity problems were not caused by laziness or equipment failures. They were caused by a new kind of thinking that was spreading from world to world like a disease. The disease was empathy, the ability to understand how other beings felt, the willingness to help strangers as if they were family. 3 days later, Enforcement Officer Yunbi arrived at Nethys Prime with orders to investigate the situation. She was young for her rank but had earned it through her skill at stopping rebellions before they could start. Her job was to identify troublemakers and eliminate them before they could spread dangerous ideas. Yunbi expected to find a typical revolutionary leader, someone who gave angry speeches about overthrowing the government, someone who taught workers how to make weapons or plan attacks. Instead, she found Jiho. He was sitting by a small fire outside the dormitories, surrounded by workers from 6 different species. But he was not giving a political speech. He was telling them a story about a human child who befriended a lonely robot. The robot had been built to fight in wars, Jiho said softly. It knew how to destroy things but not how to create them. It knew how to follow orders but not how to make friends. The child taught the robot how to plant gardens, how to tell jokes, how to take care of sick animals. Slowly, the robot learned that there were better ways to spend its time than fighting. What happened to them? Asked a young Pethri worker. They grew old together, Jiho said. The child became a teacher who helped other children learn about kindness. The robot became a guardian who protected the village from harm without hurting anyone. They proved that even things made for war could choose to create peace instead. Yunbi felt something strange happen inside her chest as she listened. The story was about friendship between different kinds of beings. It was about choosing creation over destruction. It was about the possibility that even those made for violence could find better purposes. She realized that Jiho was not teaching rebellion through anger or hatred. He was teaching something much more dangerous. He was teaching people to see goodness in each other. He was showing them that cooperation was possible, that different species could live together in harmony, that the Empire's way was not the only way. Over the next 3 days, a dust storm trapped UNB and several workers in an emergency shelter. With nothing else to do, she found herself listening to more of Jiho's stories. Stories about her own people, the Valdari from before they became conquerors. He told her about Valdari poets who wrote about the beauty of distant stars, about Valdari scientists who studied alien cultures to learn from them instead of conquering them, about Valdari explorers who made friends with strange beings on faraway worlds. What happened to those Valdari? Yunbi asked. They are still there, Jiho replied. Inside every Valdari who chooses understanding over fear. Inside every Valdari who sees other beings as people instead of property. Inside you, if you choose to let them be. When the storm ended and the shelter doors opened, Yunbi stood at a crossroads. She could arrest Jiho and end his influence. She could file a report that would bring the full might of the Empire down on these workers, or she could choose to listen to the voice inside her that sounded like the ancient Valdari poets, the ones who believed that the universe was vast enough for everyone to find their place in it. The choice she made would change everything. High Executor Minho stood before the massive viewing screen in his command center, watching red warning lights blink across the galaxy map. Each light represented a world where productivity had dropped, where workers were becoming difficult to control, where the careful order of the Empire was breaking down. In his 40 years of service, Minho had seen rebellions before. They usually started with angry speeches and secret weapons. Leaders would emerge, make demands, threaten violence. The Empire knew how to deal with such problems. They would arrest the leaders, execute a few troublemakers, and fear would restore order. But this was different. The reports coming from 300 worlds made no sense. Read me the summary from Kepler 7 again, Minho ordered his aide. Workers have formed mixed species groups during meal periods. The aide read, they share food, teach each other basic phrases in different languages, and discuss their homeworlds. Production has decreased 18%, but worker satisfaction has increased dramatically. No weapons have been found. No political demands have been made. No clear leadership structure exists. Minho frowned. What about Zeri and Beta? Similar patterns. Sir, workers help injured colleagues regardless of species. They have created informal networks for sharing resources and information. Some have begun decorating their living spaces with art that combines elements from multiple cultures. Again, no violence, no demands, no obvious leadership. The pattern was the same across dozens of worlds. Workers who had been obedient for decades were suddenly acting like they belonged to some kind of community. They were sharing instead of competing, cooperating instead of isolating, helping instead of ignoring each other. What intelligence do we have on the cause? Minho asked. His chief intelligence officer, Colonel Hansel, stepped forward with a datapad. Sir, we have traced the disturbances to a single source, a human refugee named Jiho, currently held at Mining Complex 7 on Nethys Prime. He appears to be spreading stories. Stories. Minho's voice was sharp with disbelief. You are telling me that stories are destroying the Empire? Not destroying, sir, changing. The stories seem to create emotional connections between different species. They teach workers to see similarities instead of differences. They encourage cooperation and mutual aid. Minho stared at the galaxy map. Red lights continued to blink, each one representing thousands of beings who were no longer content to remain isolated and afraid. Bring me this Jiho. I want to understand what we are dealing with. 3 days later, Jiho sat in an interrogation chamber deep within the Imperial Palace. The room was designed to intimidate, with harsh white lights and cold metal walls. Most prisoners broke down within hours, begging to confess their crimes. Jiho simply sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, waiting. When Minho entered the room, he expected to find either a dangerous revolutionary or a broken old man. Instead, he found someone who looked at him with calm, curious eyes. You are destroying my empire, Minho said, without introduction. I am telling stories. Jiho replied softly. Those stories are causing rebellion across 300 worlds. Those stories are helping people remember that they are not alone. Minho sat across from the human, studying his face. What do you want? Money, power, freedom for your people. I want nothing that you can give me, Jiho said. I want people to understand each other. I want them to know that kindness is possible even in dark places. I want them to remember that every being has value. Those ideas will destroy civilization, Minho said. Without order, without control, there is only chaos. Jiho was quiet for a moment. Then he began to speak. There was once a great city that was built on a mountain, he said. The rulers lived at the top, in beautiful palaces, with gardens and fountains. The workers lived at the bottom, in dark houses with no windows. The rulers believed this was the natural order of things. Minho wanted to stop him, to demand answers instead of stories. But something in Jiho's voice made him listen. One day an earthquake shook the mountain. Jiho continued. The palaces at the top began to crumble. The rulers called for help, but the workers at the bottom refused to come. They said the rulers had never helped them, so why should they help the rulers? So, the city fell, Minho said. No, Jiho replied. A young ruler had once visited the bottom of the mountain. She had learned the names of the workers, had eaten their simple food, had listened to their stories. When the earthquake came, she ran down to the bottom herself. She worked alongside the people to save whoever could be saved. Together, they built a new city where everyone lived at the same level. That is just a story, Minho said. It has nothing to do with reality. Every story teaches us something about reality, Jiho said. This one teaches that cooperation is stronger than control, that understanding is more powerful than fear, that even enemies can become friends if they learn to see each other as people. The interrogation continued for hours. Minho asked about weapons, about plans, about secret organizations. Jiho answered every question with another story. Stories about forgiveness, about second chances, about the possibility that even those who had done terrible things could choose to do better. By the end of the session, Minho felt more confused than when he had started. He had expected to find a criminal mastermind plotting the Empire's destruction. Instead, he had found a gentle man who seemed to genuinely believe that the universe could be a kinder place. That evening, Minho met with his chief strategist, Counselor Seojin, in his private office. What did you learn from the human? Seojin asked. He is not what I expected, Minho admitted. He is not trying to overthrow the government or start a war. He simply tells stories that make people think differently about each other. Seojin nodded. Grimly, that makes him more dangerous than any army. Sir, he is not attacking our military strength or our economic power. He is attacking the fundamental ideas that hold the empire together. Explain. Our empire exists because different species fear and distrust each other. They compete for resources, fight over territory, see each other as threats. This makes them easy to control, but if they begin to see each other as family, if they start cooperating instead of competing, then they no longer need us to maintain order. Minho walked to his window and looked out at the capital city below. Millions of beings from hundreds of worlds lived and worked there, all following the laws and customs that kept the empire running smoothly. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "We must eliminate not just the human, but everyone who has heard his stories," Seo Jin said. "Every being who has been infected with these ideas of cooperation and understanding. It will require unprecedented action, but it is the only way to preserve Valdari rule." "You are talking about genocide on a galactic scale." "I am talking about survival, sir. Either we destroy these ideas now, or they will destroy us." Meanwhile, across the galaxy, Jiho's influence continued to spread even while he sat in his prison cell. The guards who brought him food found themselves lingering to hear his stories. Maintenance workers who cleaned his cell started asking questions about life on other worlds. Even the interrogators who questioned him each day began to change. Captain Youngman had conducted thousands of interrogations during his career. He knew how to break prisoners with pain, with fear, with promises of mercy that would never come. But Jiho was different. Every session ended with the captain feeling less certain about his methods, less sure about the righteousness of his cause. The stories were like seeds planted in fertile ground. They grew in the darkness of doubt, watered by moments of unexpected kindness, reaching toward the light of possibility. Even in the heart of the imperial palace, surrounded by the most loyal servants of the empire, the ideas of cooperation and understanding began to take root. In the intelligence division, analysts who studied the spreading unrest found themselves wondering what it would feel like to live in a world where different species worked together instead of fighting. In the military command, officers who planned campaigns began to question whether conquest was truly necessary for security. High Executor Minho signed the order for Operation Silent Galaxy 3 days after his meeting with S. It was the largest military action in the Empire's history, designed to end the storytelling threat once and for all. But as the orders went out to fleet commanders across the galaxy, many of them paused before implementing the brutal instructions. They had heard whispers of the stories too. They had begun to wonder if there might be another way. The Empire was about to discover that some ideas, once planted, are impossible to destroy. Operation Silent Galaxy began at dawn, across 50 worlds. Valdari warships appeared in orbit without warning, their weapons trained on cities and mining colonies. Troops landed in transport ships, carrying orders to arrest anyone suspected of spreading dangerous stories. The crackdown was swift and merciless. On Kepler 7, soldiers surrounded the textile factory where workers had been sharing meals and stories. They separated beings by species, loading them into different transport ships. Families were torn apart. Friends were forced to watch each other disappear into prison ships. But something unexpected happened as the arrests began. The stories that Jiho had planted were no longer just stories. They had become part of how people understood the world. When soldiers came for Yunji, the young Pithori woman who had been retelling Jiho's tales, her Korvani friend Bonsu stepped forward. "Take me instead," the old miner said. "She has done nothing wrong. You will both be arrested for sedition." The soldier replied. "Then we will face it together," said a Yoltec farmer, moving to stand beside them. Soon, dozens of workers had formed a circle around Yunji and Bonsu. They linked arms and refused to move. They were not fighting or threatening violence. They were simply showing that they would not abandon each other. The soldiers had weapons and armor. They could have forced the workers apart. But many of them hesitated. Some had heard fragments of the stories too. Others recognized something in the workers' faces that reminded them of their own families. Back home, similar scenes played out across the galaxy. On Zarian Beta, workers protected each other by forming human shields around those being arrested. On Talos, beings from different species refused to identify which of their friends had been telling stories. On Vaga 9, construction crews laid down their tools and sat in silent protest until their arrested colleagues were released. The Empire had expected the crackdown to restore order through fear. Instead, it proved that everything the stories had taught was true. The Empire really was the kind of oppressive force that needed to be resisted. Every brutal action confirmed what Jiho had been saying about the importance of standing together against tyranny. In a detention center on Proxima Station, a young Corvani named Jiwan sat in a crowded cell with beings from 6 different species. Her parents had been killed during the raids on her homeworld. Her brother had been taken to a different prison. She was alone, afraid, and angry, but she was not broken. "My grandmother used to tell me about the old days," she said quietly to her cellmates. "Before the Valdari came, our people explored the stars in great ships. We mapped new worlds and made friends with strange beings. We believed the universe was big enough for everyone." An old Petheri woman nodded. "My people were artists before. We became slaves. We painted murals that told the history of our worlds. We composed music that could make people weep with joy. My ancestors were farmers," added a Yultek man. "We grew food that could feed millions. We understood how to work with nature instead of fighting against it." As they shared these memories, something powerful began to happen. The prisoners realized They were not just random victims of imperial cruelty. They were the inheritors of proud traditions, the children of peoples who had accomplished great things. The empire had tried to make them forget their heritage, but the stories were helping them remember. Word of the arrests reached Jiho in his prison cell through a guard named Private Minsu. The young soldier had been assigned to watch the human storyteller, but he found himself drawn into conversations instead. They are arresting thousands of people, Minsu told Jiho during one of his visits. Beings who never hurt anyone, who only shared stories and helped their neighbors. How can this be right? Jiho looked at the young man with sad but understanding eyes. What do you think? He asked gently. I think we are becoming the evil that people need to fight against, Minsu said. I joined the military to protect the empire, but who are we protecting it from? People who want to be kind to each other. That night, Minsu made a choice that would change his life forever. Instead of reporting for duty, he opened Jiho's cell door and helped him escape. They were caught within hours, but the damage was done. Other guards had seen Minsu's act of defiance. They began asking themselves the same questions he had asked. If protecting the empire meant hurting innocent people, what were they really protecting? The doubts spread through the military like cracks in a dam. Admiral Hunwoo, commanding the fleet responsible for Operation Silent Galaxy, found his own officers questioning their orders. Sir, the prisoners on Deck 7 are asking for medical attention, reported Commander Jinsu. They have been beaten during interrogation. That is standard procedure, Hunwoo replied, though his voice lacked conviction. With respect, sir, one of them is a child, a young Yultek girl who was arrested for teaching other children how to read. What threat could she possibly pose to the empire? Hunwoo had no good answer. He had been a soldier for 30 years, had fought in dozens of campaigns against rebel forces and pirate fleets, but he had never been asked to wage war against teachers and storytellers, against people whose only crime was treating each other with kindness. That evening, strange things began happening throughout the Imperial fleet. Guards forgot to lock certain cell doors. Transport schedules became confused, allowing some prisoners to escape during transfers. Communication equipment mysteriously malfunctioned, preventing arrest orders from reaching their destinations. The rebellion was spreading. But it was unlike any rebellion in history. There were no armies marching against imperial cities. No fleets of rebel ships attacking Valdari strongholds. Instead, there were millions of individual choices made by people who had learned to see each other as family rather than strangers. In the Imperial Palace, High Executor Minho received reports that filled him with growing dread. Operation Silent Galaxy was failing not because of enemy resistance, but because his own forces were refusing to carry out their orders. How many defections? He asked Colonel Hansel. 17 ships have declared themselves neutral and withdrawn from combat zones, Hansel replied. 43 prison facilities have reported security failures that allowed mass escapes. Over 300 officers have submitted requests for reassignment or early retirement. What about the human? Minho demanded. Is he at least contained? He escaped 2 days ago. Sir, Private Minsu helped him flee, but both were recaptured within 6 hours. Execute them both, Minho ordered. Make it public. Show everyone what happens to traitors. But even that order would prove impossible to carry out. The executioner assigned to the task was a veteran soldier named Sergeant Hayek, who had served the empire faithfully for 20 years. When he was given his orders, he asked to speak with the prisoners first. Jiho told him a story about a soldier who had been ordered to destroy a village. The soldier discovered that the village was full of teachers, doctors, and artists who had never harmed anyone. He had to choose between following orders and following his conscience. What did the soldier do? Sergeant Hayek asked. He chose to become the kind of person he could respect, Jiho replied. He chose to protect the innocent instead of destroying them. The next morning, when the time came for the execution, Sergeant Hayek stood before the gathered crowd and announced that he could not carry out the sentence. Other soldiers stepped forward to join him. Soon, the entire execution detail had laid down their weapons. The crowd watched in amazement as Imperial soldiers chose mercy over duty, conscience over orders. The message was clear to everyone present. Even the Empire's most loyal servants had been changed by the power of understanding and compassion. High Executor Minho realized that he faced an impossible situation. He could not maintain order through force because his forces no longer believed in what they were fighting for. He could not crush the rebellion because the rebellion existed in the hearts and minds of his own people. The stories had won a victory that no army could have achieved. They had transformed the empire from within, proving that ideas based on love and understanding were stronger than any system built on fear and control. But the transformation was far from complete. The real test would come when the empire had to choose between doubling down on oppression or finding a new way to exist. In a galaxy where different peoples had learned to see each other as family, the execution was scheduled for noon on Validation Day, the Empire's most important holiday. Screens across 300 worlds would show the death of the human who had dared to challenge Valdari authority. High Executor Minho believed that watching Jiho die would crush the spirit of rebellion and restore order to the galaxy. But he was wrong. Jiho stood calmly on the platform in the center of Imperial Square, surrounded by thousands of beings from across the empire. Many had traveled great distances to witness this moment. Some came hoping to see the troublemaker punished. Others came to honor the man whose stories had changed their lives. The executioner raised his weapon. But before he could fire, Jiho spoke. "I would like to tell you one last story," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "Silence the prisoner," Minho ordered from his viewing platform. But the executioner hesitated. Sergeant Hyok had been replaced by another soldier, but this one had also heard whispers of the stories. He found himself curious about what the human's final words would be. "There was once a small act of kindness," Jiho began, "that changed the course of history." A tired traveler stopped at a village during a terrible storm. The villagers were poor and had little food, but an old woman invited the stranger into her home. She shared her last bit of bread with him and gave him her only blanket. The crowd listened in complete silence. Even those who had come to celebrate Jiho's death found themselves drawn into the story. The traveler was so moved by this kindness that he decided to spend the rest of his life helping others. He became a teacher, and his students became teachers, and their students became teachers. Each generation passed on, not just knowledge, but the memory of compassion. "Execute him now," Minho commanded, but his voice seemed small and distant. Years later, Jiho continued. When war came to that region, the descendants of those teachers chose peace over violence. They opened their cities to refugees from all sides. They fed the hungry and healed the wounded without asking which army they had served. Their example spread to other cities, other worlds, until the entire war ended not in victory for one side, but in understanding between all sides. The executioner's hand trembled on his weapon. Around the square, beings from dozens of different species found tears running down their faces. They understood that they were witnessing not just the death of one man, but the birth of something that could never be killed. The old woman never knew that her small act of kindness would echo across the centuries. Jiho said, "She simply saw a fellow being in need and chose to help. That is all any of us can do. Choose kindness when we have the chance. Choose understanding when we face the unknown. Choose love when the world tells us to hate." The weapon fired Jiho fell to the platform, but something extraordinary happened in that moment. Across the galaxy, beings who had never met the human storyteller felt his loss as if they had known him personally. His death became not an ending but a beginning. In the days that followed, memorial gatherings formed spontaneously on hundreds of worlds. Beings shared stories about Jiho, about his teachings, about how his words had changed their lives. But more importantly, they began sharing their own stories about kindness, about cooperation, about the possibility of building a better future. On Kepler 7, the workers who had been arrested during Operation Silent Galaxy were released by guards who could no longer justify keeping them imprisoned. They returned to find their factory transformed. Beings from different species had continued working together, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. On Zarian Beta, former enemies worked side by side to repair damage caused by the Imperial crackdown. Corvani miners taught Petheri technicians how to extract crystals without damaging them. Yoltec farmers shared techniques for growing food in the factory's hydroponic gardens. The transformation was not limited to the outer colonies. Even on the core worlds where Valdari families had ruled for generations, change was stirring. Nari had been an intelligence officer for 15 years, skilled at finding rebels and stopping uprisings before they could begin. But after hearing about Jiho's execution, she found herself unable to continue her work. She began secretly documenting the Empire's crimes, creating records of the atrocities committed during Operation Silent Galaxy. Her reports were not filled with propaganda or justifications, but with the personal stories of those who had suffered, the names of children separated from their parents, the dreams of artists whose works had been destroyed, the final words of teachers who had died for the crime of spreading hope. These new stories spread just as quickly as Jiho's had, but they served a different purpose. They helped people understand the true cost of maintaining an empire through fear and oppression. They showed that behind every statistic was a person with hopes and fears, someone who deserved to be treated with dignity. Across the galaxy, similar transformations were taking place. Military officers were refusing to carry out brutal orders. Administrators were finding ways to help the people they were supposed to control. Even members of the ruling families were beginning to question whether their privileged lives were worth the suffering of billions. Commander Jinsu had been assigned to lead a punitive expedition against a colony world that had declared independence from the Empire. When his fleet arrived in orbit, he expected to find desperate rebels preparing for a hopeless fight. Instead, he found something that left him speechless. The colonists had gathered in their largest city square, not with weapons, but with stories. Thousands of beings from dozens of species stood together, sharing tales of their home worlds, their families, their dreams for the future. When Jinsu's ships appeared overhead, they did not run or hide. They simply continued telling their stories. Children spoke about wanting to explore the stars like their ancestors had done. Elders shared memories of times when different peoples had lived in peace. Artists described visions of cities where all beings could thrive together. Jinsu found himself listening through the communication systems, drawn into the narratives despite himself. His crew gathered around the speakers, forgetting their orders as they heard tales of courage, compassion, and hope. "Sir," his communications officer said quietly, "they are not resisting. They are just living their lives as if we were not here. They are showing us what they believe in," Jinsu replied, understanding dawning in his voice. "They are proving that another way is possible." One by one, the ships in Jinsu's fleet powered down their weapons. Some crew members requested permission to visit the planet's surface, not as conquerors but as guests. They wanted to hear more stories, to learn about different cultures, to see for themselves what a cooperative society might look like. Hi. Executor Minho received reports of these defections with growing desperation. The Empire was not being defeated by armies or weapons. It was simply being abandoned by people who had found something better to believe in. In his private chambers, surrounded by the symbols of imperial power, Minho finally understood what Jiho had been trying to tell him. The Empire existed only because people agreed to participate in it. When they stopped believing in its principles, when they chose cooperation over competition, when they saw each other as family rather than strangers, the Empire became irrelevant. The transformation was not complete. There were still worlds where the old ways persisted, still beings who clung to hatred and fear. But change was spreading like ripples across a pond, carried by the most powerful force in the universe. The force of story, the power of one being reaching out to another and saying, "You are not alone, you are not forgotten, you matter." Jiho was gone, but his legacy lived on in every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, every choice to build bridges instead of walls. The storyteller, who had carried no weapons, had given the galaxy something more powerful than any army. He had given them the ability to see through each other's eyes, to recognize their shared hopes and dreams, to understand that their differences made them stronger rather than weaker. The Empire would never be the same. 5 years after Jiho's death, the galaxy looked completely different. The Valdari Empire still existed on official maps, but its meaning had changed. Instead of ruling through fear and control, it had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a community of worlds where different species worked together by choice rather than force. The transformation had not happened overnight. There had been conflicts, misunderstandings, and moments when old hatreds threatened to destroy the fragile peace. But each time tensions rose, someone would tell a story. A tale of cooperation that had worked before. A memory of kindness that had overcome cruelty. A vision of what could be possible if people chose understanding over fear. On Nethys Prime, the mining complex where Jiho had first shared his stories had become something remarkable. The dormitories had been converted into comfortable homes, where families from different species lived side by side. The mines still operated, but workers chose their own schedules and shared the profits from their labor. Children played together in gardens. Built where security fences once stood, Taehoon walked through these gardens every morning before starting his work. He had once been an overseer who controlled workers through intimidation and punishment. Now, he was a coordinator who helped different teams communicate and cooperate. The change had not been easy for him, but it had been necessary. He remembered the day everything changed. A young Corvani worker had approached him with a proposal to improve mine safety. In the old days, Taehoon would have dismissed the suggestion and punished the worker for speaking without permission. Instead, he had listened. The proposal had saved dozens of lives and increased productivity at the same time. That experience had taught Taehoon something important. When people were treated with respect, when their ideas were valued, when they felt like partners rather than property, they accomplished amazing things. The transformation had spread beyond individual worlds to the entire galactic community. The Imperial communication networks that had once carried orders and propaganda now served a different purpose. They connected beings across vast distances, allowing them to share stories, trade ideas, and learn from each other's experiences. A farming technique developed on Talos was now being used to feed hungry populations on a dozen other worlds. Music composed by Petheri artists brought joy to beings who had never heard such beauty before. Scientific discoveries made by Corvani researchers helped solve problems that had plagued multiple species for generations. The diversity that the Empire had tried to suppress had become its greatest strength. Sora had been one of the last holdouts against the changes. As a high-ranking Valdari administrator, she had believed that order required hierarchy, that peace required strong leadership, that prosperity required someone to be in charge. But her assignment to a frontier colony had changed her perspective completely. She had arrived expecting to find chaos and conflict. The colony included beings from 12 different species, with no clear authority structure and no formal government. According to everything she had been taught, such a community should have torn itself apart within weeks. Instead, she found a thriving settlement where problems were solved through discussion and compromise, where resources were shared according to need, where conflicts were resolved through storytelling and mediation rather than force. A Yale-Tech engineer had developed a new water purification system. A Pethary artist had designed beautiful and functional architecture. A Corvini historian was preserving the stories and traditions of all the represented species, each being contributed their unique skills and knowledge to the common good. When Sora's transport broke down during a meteor storm, the colonists worked together to repair it. They did not ask for payment or demand favors in return. They simply helped because helping was what neighbors did for each other. That experience had shattered Sora's remaining beliefs about the necessity of imperial control. She requested permanent assignment to the colony and spent her remaining years learning how to be a participant rather than a ruler. The changes were not limited to the outer territories. Even on the core worlds where Valderi culture had its deepest roots, new forms of governance were emerging. Traditional ruling families found their power shifting as citizens became more involved in making decisions that affected their communities. Instead of issuing orders from isolated palaces, leaders had to listen to different perspectives and build consensus among diverse groups. The process was messy and sometimes frustrating, but it produced better results than the old system of absolute authority. Problems were solved more creatively when multiple minds worked on them. Policies were more fair when they considered the needs of all affected parties. Society was more stable when everyone felt they had a voice in their own destiny. High Executor Minho had stepped down from his position 3 years after Jiho's death. He spent his final years writing memoirs that told the story of the Empire's transformation from his perspective. His book became one of the most widely read works in the galaxy, not because it justified the old system, but because it honestly examined the costs of maintaining power through oppression. In his conclusion, Minho wrote something that would be quoted for generations to come. We believed that strength meant the ability to force others to obey. We learned that true strength comes from inspiring others to cooperate. We thought that unity required everyone to be the same. We discovered that real unity celebrates differences while recognizing shared hopes and dreams. The galaxy had become an empire of stories rather than an empire of force. Children grew up hearing tales from dozens of different cultures. Scientists shared discoveries across species boundaries. Artists collaborated on works that no single imagination could have created alone. Trade between worlds increased as trust replaced suspicion. Exploration resumed as former enemies became partners in discovering new frontiers. Technology advanced rapidly as researchers combined knowledge from multiple traditions. But perhaps most importantly, the galaxy had learned something that would protect it from future tyrants. The people had discovered that they did not need anyone else to grant them permission to be kind to each other, to work together, to build the kind of communities they wanted to live in. They had learned that power belonged to those who chose to use it responsibly, not those who seized it through violence. Years later, when children asked how such an amazing transformation had been possible, their elders would tell them the story of a human named Jiho, who had carried only stories but had changed everything. They would explain that every person has stories worth sharing, that listening is as important as speaking, that understanding others does not require agreeing with them, and that small acts of kindness can echo across the galaxy for generations. Most importantly, they would teach that the power to create change exists within everyone who chooses to see other beings as people rather than obstacles, as family rather than strangers, as partners in building a better future rather than competitors for limited resources. The storyteller who had carried no weapons had given the galaxy the most powerful tool of all, the ability to imagine a better world and then work together to make it real. His stories lived on, not as fixed tales repeated word for word, but as living traditions that grew and changed with each telling. New voices added new perspectives. Different cultures contributed different wisdom. Each generation found new meanings in the old stories while creating new stories of their own. The Empire of Stories had no borders because stories could travel anywhere. It had no enemies because enemies could become friends once they understood each other's tales. It had no ending because as long as beings chose kindness over cruelty, understanding over ignorance, and cooperation over conflict, the story would continue forever. In the end, Jiho had been right about the most important thing of all. Everyone carries stories, and those stories have the power to change the world. The only question is whether we choose to share them with love or keep them locked away in fear. The galaxy had made its choice. It chose love, and in doing so, it chose hope for all the stories yet to be told.